The morning my ex-husband handed me a check for $4,000 and told me to sign the papers, I was wearing the blue cardigan I had knitted the winter we got engaged. I remember looking down at the loose thread on the left sleeve, the one I had been meaning to fix for 2 years, and thinking that was probably a sign I had ignored for longer than I cared to admit. His name was Connor. Connor. James Whitfield. We had been married for 4 years, together for 2 before that. 6 years of my life packed into 3 banker's boxes and a rolling suitcase I borrowed from my mother because Connor had bought our luggage together, and he said very calmly that the luggage was technically a joint purchase and he would prefer to keep the set intact. I did not argue. By that point, I had learned that arguing with Connor was like trying to reason with a tide. You did not stop it. You just got wet. The reason he gave, when he finally gave one, was that I was emotionally unavailable. That I prioritized my nursing shifts over our marriage, that he had tried, really tried, and that he deserved someone who could be present. He said this with the kind of measured sincerity that I later understood he had probably rehearsed because 2 weeks after I moved out, a colleague of mine saw him at a restaurant in downtown Portland with a woman from his office. They were not eating like coworkers. They were not even eating like friends. I found out on a Tuesday. I processed it alone in my new apartment on a Wednesday. By Thursday, I had cried enough to feel hollowed out, and by Friday, I had decided that hollow was fine. Hollow was manageable. Hollow could go to work and chart patient vitals and smile at the nurse's station and come home and eat cereal over the sink without anyone needing to know the difference. The apartment was on the 3rd floor of a converted brick building in a neighborhood called Crestwood on the east side of Portland. It was small, 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, a kitchen with a window that faced a courtyard where someone had left a rusted bicycle chained to a drain pipe for what appeared to be several years. My mother had helped me find it. She had driven up from Eugene with a carload of things she said I needed. An extra set of towels, a casserole dish, 2 lamps, and a spider plant in a terracotta pot that she placed on my windowsill without asking, and said, "Plants keep a space from feeling like a waiting room." She did not ask me how I was doing in the way that meant she needed a detailed answer. She asked in the way that meant she was watching, and she would be ready when I needed her. But she would not push. My mother had been through her own version of this 20 years earlier with my father. She understood the particular silence of starting over in a space that still smelled like paint and someone else's cleaning products. The man in 3B did not introduce himself for 3 weeks. I knew he existed because I could hear him sometimes through the shared wall, not loudly, not in any disruptive way, just the low sound of movement, a door, occasionally a television. I had seen him twice in the hallway. Both times he had a yellow Labrador on a leash, and both times he had given me a brief nod and continued toward the stairwell without the kind of performative friendliness that some people deploy in apartment buildings as a way of making themselves feel less anonymous. I appreciated that. I was not ready for performative friendliness. The 3rd time I saw him was a Saturday morning, October, and I was in the courtyard attempting to bring in 3 bags of groceries and my work bag and my thermos all at once, which was a project that was not going as planned. One of the bags had a carton of eggs in it, and I had miscalculated the angle of the door, and the bag hit the frame, and I watched it happen in the slow, inevitable way of things you cannot stop once they have started. He came through the courtyard door at exactly that moment. The dog's leash was looped over his wrist. He looked at the eggs. He looked at me. "I've got it," he said, and he picked up the bag before I could protest and held the door open while I gathered the rest. "You didn't have to do that," I said in the elevator. "The eggs were already gone," he said. "At least this way you have the rest." His name was Daniel. Daniel Reeves. He said it the way people say things that are simply facts, without any particular weight, and then he handed me the bag in the hallway outside 3B and went inside. I thought about that for longer than the interaction probably warranted. Over the following weeks, we built a kind of hallway friendship, which is its own specific category of relationship. Brief, context-dependent, oddly comfortable. He asked about my shifts when he saw me leaving in scrubs. I asked about the dog, whose name was Henry, and who had a personality that could only be described as deeply optimistic about all people and all situations. Daniel was quieter than Henry. He wore plain clothes, work boots, canvas jackets, jeans, and he drove a truck that was old enough to have some rust on the wheel wells. He had a calm about him that I found, at the time, simply restful. After 4 years with Connor's particular brand of controlled intensity, restful felt like a gift. I did not ask what he did for work. He did not volunteer it. I assumed construction or contracting based on the boots and the hours he kept, which were early in the morning and inconsistent in a way that suggested project-based work. In November, my mother called and I made the mistake of taking the call while making dinner, which meant I burned the rice and also started crying somewhere around the part where she asked if I was eating well, which was not really about eating and we both knew it. Daniel knocked on my door 40 minutes later with 2 containers of soup from the Thai place on Morrison Street. He said through the door, "I ordered too much. It'll go bad." I let him in. We ate soup at my small table, and he did not ask me why my eyes were red, and I did not explain. Henry sat between us with the serene confidence of a dog who has never once doubted his welcome in any space. After that, it became a thing we did sometimes: dinner, or coffee on weekend mornings, or walks with Henry along the river path when my shifts allowed. It was not romantic, not then. Or rather, it was the kind of thing that becomes romantic slowly, the way a room warms up when you've had a fire going for a while. You don't notice the exact moment it changes. You just realize, at some point, that you are no longer cold. The call from Connor came in December. I did not recognize the number he was using, which was why I answered. He wanted to know if I had received the final divorce paperwork. I had. I told him I had. He said, "Good." And then he said several other things in his measured, rehearsed way, things about how he hoped I was moving forward, things about how he genuinely wished me well, things that were designed to make him feel generous rather than to make me feel anything in particular. Then he said he had heard I was still in Portland. He said it in a way that was not a question. I said yes, I was still in Portland. He said he thought it might be easier for both of us if I considered relocating. He had said this before in a more veiled way, in the months before the divorce was final. Connor had a lot of professional contacts in Portland. He had a social life that I was now, technically, adjacent to whether either of us chose that or not. He seemed to find my continued presence in the same city personally inconvenient, and he was not fully able to hide that behind the language of my well-being. I said I was not planning to relocate. He said he understood, and he wished me well again. And he hung up. I sat on my couch for a while after that, and then I went and knocked on Daniel's door. He opened it and looked at me for a moment, and then he stepped back and let me in without asking. Henry came immediately to put his head against my knee. I sat down on Daniel's couch, which was large and worn and comfortable in the way of furniture that has been actually used, and I told him the whole story. Connor and the 6 years and the $4,000 and the cardigan and all of it. I had not told anyone the full version. I had given my mother a partial version and my coworkers a minimal version, and I had not told anyone that the part that hurt most was not the betrayal exactly, but the $4,000. The careless smallness of it. 6 years distilled to a check that Connor had probably written in about 40 seconds. Daniel listened. He did not offer opinions or solutions. He made coffee without being asked. When I was done talking, he was quiet for a moment. And then he said, "You're not actually upset about the money?" "No," I said. "I'm upset that he thought that's what I was worth." He nodded slowly. He was wrong. He said it plainly, without decoration, the way he said most things. Not as a comfort and not as flattery, just as a correction to an incorrect statement. I believed him in a way I had not believed similar things said in more elaborate ways. I went back to my apartment at midnight. I did not sleep for a long time, but it was a different kind of awake than I'd been for the past several months. Less like being stranded, more like waiting for something I couldn't name yet. Connor appeared in February, not at my apartment. He didn't have the address, or if he did, he hadn't used it. He appeared at the coffee shop where I sometimes stopped before my shift, which was either a coincidence or not, and which I did not immediately know how to categorize. He was with 2 people I vaguely recognized from his firm, and he saw me at the counter and came over, with the particular ease of someone who has decided in advance how a moment will go. He was friendly. He was warm. He said I looked well, and he said it with the slight emphasis of someone who had expected otherwise. He asked about my job, and he said a few things about the firm, and at some point in the conversation he mentioned, in a casual way, that he had been spending a lot of time with some people in commercial real estate. Interesting work. Very good people involved. He said the name of one of them in a way that was meant to communicate that this was an important name. I drove to the hospital afterward feeling like I had swallowed something dense. Connor hadn't done anything overt. He had just reminded me that he had a life with dimension and weight and professional momentum, and that mine was, from his vantage point, still the small thing it had been when he left it. I told Daniel about it that evening. He was quiet for a moment, and then he asked what the name was, the one Connor had mentioned in real estate. I told him. He looked at his coffee cup. He didn't say anything. "Do you know him?" I asked. "A little," he said. He did not elaborate, and I did not press. There was something in his expression I couldn't read, the way there sometimes was. A brief stillness, like he was making a small decision about something. I assumed it was the ordinary kind of evasion that comes when someone knows a peripheral acquaintance of your ex and doesn't want to get tangled in anything. In March, Daniel told me he had to travel for work for a few weeks. He left Henry with me. It was not a small thing. Henry was particular about strangers, and Daniel was particular about Henry, and the fact that this was offered and accepted without significant discussion said something about where we were, even if we hadn't said it out loud yet. He came back on a Thursday. I heard the door to 3B and then a knock on mine, and when I opened it, he looked tired in the specific way of someone who has been working very hard at something, and he had a paper bag of pastries from the French place on Burnside that I had mentioned once, months earlier, in a conversation I had not expected him to retain. He remembered small things. I had been noticing that for a while. We sat on my floor with the pastries and coffee, and Henry distributed between us, and at some point he said, quietly, that he had something to tell me. His full name, he said, was Daniel Reeves, which I knew. What I did not know was that Daniel Reeves was also the founder of Reeves Capital, a real estate development and investment firm that managed somewhere north of $300 million in assets across the Pacific Northwest. He had started it at 26 with money he had inherited from his grandfather, a Portland contractor who had bought industrial land in the 70s that nobody had wanted and that had, eventually, been worth a great deal. Daniel had grown up watching his grandfather work with his hands and had never been particularly interested in performing wealth, and so he didn't. He wore work boots because he spent actual time on job sites. He drove the old truck because it was his grandfather's and he intended to keep it running until he couldn't. He lived in apartment 3B because he owned the building and had converted the third floor into his own space while managing the rest as affordable housing, which was a project he had been running quietly for 8 years. I sat with this for a moment. "Why are you telling me now?" I asked. He said, "Because I should have told you sooner, and because something came up recently that made it relevant, and because I don't want there to be something you don't know when there's something I feel like this is becoming." The something that had come up was Connor. The name he had mentioned, the commercial real estate contact, was someone who had approached Reeves Capital earlier that year about a development deal. Daniel's team had vetted the principals, as they always did, and in the course of that process had turned up things about Connor's firm that were not illegal, but were the kind of things that make you understand exactly what kind of person you are considering doing business with. The deal had been declined. That had been, apparently, what Connor was obliquely referencing in the coffee shop, trying to understand why the meeting had gone cold, without knowing that the person on the other side of that decision was someone who had been making soup for his ex-wife for the past 4 months. "You didn't say anything," I said. "It wasn't my story to tell," he said, "and I wasn't trying to rescue you from anything. You were already fine." I looked at him for a long moment. Henry put his head in my lap. "I'm not upset," I said. "I just need to think." He nodded. "Take whatever time you need." I took 4 days. I went to Eugene and sat on my mother's porch and told her everything. Daniel, the building, the company, the whole arc of the past 6 months. And she listened in the way she always did, fully and without performing her reactions. When I was done, she was quiet for a while, looking at her garden. "Is he kind?" she asked. "He brought me soup," I said, "before any of this. When he thought he was just my neighbor." She nodded. "Then the rest is just paperwork." She said it lightly, but I understood what she meant. The rest was real, but it was not the point. The point was the soup. The point was the pastries from the place I had mentioned once. The point was that he had looked at me in the hallway with broken eggs, and he had simply picked up the bag. I drove back to Portland on a Sunday morning. I knocked on 3B. He opened the door and I said, "Okay." He didn't ask okay what. He knew. We were not reckless about it. We were two people who had both been careful in different ways for a long time, and we moved forward with the kind of intentionality that felt appropriate to what it was. He told me more about the company, the buildings, the work, and I told him more about nursing, about the night shifts, about what it is to be with people in the hours when they are most frightened, and how that shapes you in ways you don't always have language for. We fit together in the way of people who have spent time understanding what they actually need, rather than what they thought they were supposed to want. In April, Connor filed a complaint with the Oregon Real Estate Agency about Reeves Capital's decision to withdraw from the deal, claiming procedural irregularities. It was, according to Daniel's attorney, a very thin complaint. It was also transparently retaliatory, and the attorney moved to have it dismissed. I found out when Daniel mentioned it, matter-of-factly, over dinner. He did not seem agitated. He said these things happened sometimes, that Connor's firm had a pattern of this behavior, and that it would be resolved. He said it the way he said most things, as information, not as drama. "He did this because of me," I said. "He did this because of him," Daniel said. "Don't carry his behavior." The complaint was dismissed in 6 weeks. In May, I was late. I took 3 tests over 2 days, and they all said the same thing, and I sat on the bathroom floor with the 3rd one in my hand and felt something pass through me that was large and warm and a little terrifying. I had wanted this for years, quietly. Connor had said he wanted it too, and then when it didn't happen in the first 18 months, he began implying in his careful way that the problem was mine, that I was too stressed, that nursing hours were not exactly conducive to the kind of emotional availability a child would need. He said these things gently, and I had half believed them, and I had carried that half-belief like a stone in my coat pocket for years. I told Daniel sitting on the couch with Henry across both our feet, and before I was even finished speaking, he had taken my hand, not with any particular declaration, just held it, the way you hold something you intend to keep. The appointment was 6 weeks later. The technician moved the wand, and I watched the screen, and she said in a professional tone, "So, there are 2. I turned my head to look at Daniel. He was looking at the screen with an expression I had never seen on him before. Not calm, not composed, just completely and visibly undone in the best possible way. He laughed once, quietly, and then he pressed his free hand over his mouth like he needed to hold something in. 2, I said. 2, he confirmed. We were in the parking lot afterward, standing by the old truck, and he looked at me for a long moment in the late afternoon light, and he said, "I know this is not how most people do this, the order of things." "No," I said. "Are you okay with the order of things?" I thought about Connor handing me a check and a cardigan with a loose thread. I thought about my mother's spider plant on the windowsill. I thought about Henry and the soup and the pastries and the way Daniel had said he was wrong, like it was simply a fact that needed correcting. "I'm better than okay," I said. "We told my mother on a Saturday. She cried immediately and without apology, which was unusual for her, and then she laughed, and then she cried again, and she said, 2. Of course it's 2. This family has always had to catch up all at once." I didn't fully understand what she meant, but I understood the feeling. Connor found out in June. Not from me. I had no contact with Connor. He found out because we live in Portland and it is smaller than it feels, and because mutual acquaintances exist whether or not you cultivate them, and because someone had apparently seen Daniel and me at the farmer's market and noted the visible evidence of the pregnancy and connected the apartment building ownership to the name and done the arithmetic. I received a message from him that evening. I did not respond to it. I showed it to Daniel not because I needed him to handle it, but because I did not want it to be a thing I held alone in a drawer somewhere. Daniel read it, set down his coffee, and said he'd have his attorney send a note about appropriate contact. "That's all?" I said. "That's all he gets," Daniel said. It was not dramatic. It was not a scene. It was simply the end of something being handled by someone who understood that the most effective response to certain kinds of behavior was proportional, documented, and completely unconcerned. I thought about the lavender pot. No, the rose bush my mother had given us when we moved into the house Daniel owned on the east side, the one with the deep porch and the courtyard garden where Henry could run. It was a climbing rose, old and a little wild, and the previous tenants had let it get unruly. I had spent a Saturday in early spring cutting it back, and my mother had watched from the porch steps and said I was being too aggressive, and I had said I wasn't. I was just giving it room to grow in the right direction. She had been there when it bloomed in May. Deep pink, more than I expected, more than it had probably bloomed in years. The girls were born in November, on a Tuesday, in the same hospital where I worked. 2 of my colleagues were there for the delivery. One of them, a nurse I had trained with, held my hand through the hardest part and told me I was doing great in the specific, confident way that only people who have stood in that room 100 times can say it and actually make you believe it. Daniel was there the whole time in the way that mattered. Present, not in the way, saying the right things. And also sometimes not saying anything, just being a fixed point in a room that was otherwise spinning. Ellie came first. 6 pounds and 2 ounces, with a full head of dark hair and an expression of profound irritation at having been disturbed. Rose came 4 minutes later, slightly smaller, and immediately more curious about where she had arrived than about expressing any grievances. I held one in each arm in the quiet after the room had settled, and Daniel sat on the edge of the bed with his hand resting near mine, and Henry was downstairs in the lobby with my mother, who had reportedly been explaining to every person who passed that she was waiting for her granddaughters, plural. "Ellie and Rose," I said. "Ellie and Rose," he agreed. My mother came up an hour later, still in her coat. She stood in the doorway for a moment, and then came in without any of her usual composure and simply looked at the 2 of them in the way of someone who has been handed back something she was afraid had been lost. She kissed my forehead. She did not say anything for a while. Then she said, "The rose bush is going to need cutting back again in spring." "I know," I said. "You're good at it. I'm getting better at it." She pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down, and Daniel got up to get her coffee from the machine down the hall, and through the window the Portland skyline sat in the early winter dark with all its ordinary and extraordinary lights. And neither my daughters cared about any of it yet because they were 4 hours old and the world was still mostly warmth and sound and the specific gravity of being held. Connor, I heard later through channels that were not me, had left Portland. His firm had lost 2 significant contracts in the fall and restructured quietly, which is the kind of thing that happens and which nobody announces. He relocated to Seattle. I did not feel anything particular about this. I did not feel triumphant, and I did not feel sorry. I felt, mostly, nothing, which is its own kind of resolution, the one where someone simply stops mattering enough to produce a reaction. The man who thought I was worth $4,000 was in Seattle. I was in Portland in a hospital room with 2 daughters and a man who had once picked up my groceries in a courtyard and known, from that small act, what kind of person he intended to be. My mother stayed for 2 weeks. She slept in the guest room and woke up for the 2 a.m. feedings with a willingness that suggested she had been waiting years for exactly this. She and Daniel worked out a system for the nights, quietly and without conflict, in the way of 2 practical people who care about the same thing and do not need to argue about logistics. One morning I came downstairs to find the 2 of them at the kitchen table with Ellie between them and coffee, getting cold, and my mother telling Daniel about my father, about the winter she had started over, about the plant she had bought for her new apartment because she had read somewhere that caring for something growing was good for the parts of you that felt like they were dying. She was not telling it as a sad story. She was telling it as the story that led here, and Daniel was listening with the same quality of attention he had given me the first night on the couch. The full kind, the kind that does not drift. I stood in the doorway for a moment before they noticed me. Henry was on the floor with his head resting on my mother's foot. I thought about 6 years in a check and a cardigan, and what it costs to finally understand that the price someone puts on you is not the price you actually are. I thought about the rosebush on the south wall of the garden, dormant now, pulled back and waiting, going to be extraordinary in spring. I went to join them,